And I'd like to introduce our next moderator, Alice Rogoff, who we heard from a bit yesterday. Alice is the publisher and owner of Alaska Dispatch News. She served as the chief financial officer of U.S. News and World Report and was the creator of the weekly edition of the Washington Post. My personal favorite fact about Alice, one of many, is that during her spare time, Alice flies her Cessna 206 around Alaska and has served as a chief pilot during the Iditarod Trail sled dog race, in which she provides Alaskans with live coverage of the race. Additionally, Alaska Dispatch News, I'm not sure if this was formally mentioned last night, Alaska Dispatch and Alice were the proud sponsors of Byron Nikolai, our amazing guest performer last night. So please join me in welcoming Alice.
Thank you all. Now, this is primarily a time for people to get a few precious minutes to ask these two extraordinarily capable leader women. So I'm not going to take up much time except to say, please come up to the microphones and get ready to ask your best questions. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask Senator Lisa my best question, at least my hardest question, for which I honestly want to know your best answer, even if it's a hard one. We all keep talking about revenue sharing out of Arctic offshore, either oil production or maybe even some sharing of the lease fees I've heard people mention today. Tell us from your best and most cynical perspective, given the politics of Washington, how you handicap either or both of those things happening anytime soon.
I actually think that we have a real shot at revenue sharing in the near term. And I couch my words carefully because near term in Washington, D.C. speak could mean just about anything. But I do think what you have is a growing coalition of those that are interested in advancing a revenue sharing proposal that would incorporate the coastal producing states. As you know, Louisiana has through the GOMESA legislation, has their revenue sharing component. We actually had a short debate, if you will, on revenue sharing this past week when we had the Keystone XL pipeline in front of us. We had an amendment that was offered by the senator from Louisiana, and in fairness, it was an amendment that was drafted to help Louisiana. It was something that, as an Alaskan, I could not support. It was something that the senators from the eastern seaboard state, all supporters of revenue sharing, could not support. But what it did was it brought those of us from these coastal states that want to work an arrangement for revenue sharing, brought us together in a pretty interesting and dynamic conversation. That's important. Because if we have a kind of a bifurcation of interests, if we have coastal states that, yes, support a revenue sharing plan, but haven't come together in terms of what that might look like, we're never going to get it. We will never get it. And Alice, you mentioned when we talk about revenue sharing and the benefits to Alaska, for purposes of building out this much-needed infrastructure, I would remind folks that revenue sharing doesn't get us anywhere if we don't have anything to share because we're not producing anything yet. So we've got to get moving on how we produce more, how we bring on additional production, so then we've got something to share. But I am being cynical as I say this because we've been talking about revenue sharing for a long time, but you have some political momentum now on the eastern seaboard from some colleagues that we have never had before. Revenue sharing has always been, well, that's just something that Alaska wants and that's something that Louisiana wants. As long as that's the view, it's going to be a pretty tough sell. I think we've got more opportunity now that is realistic. We've got to make our case as to why those states that host the operations from their shore, but then contribute overall to the federal treasury, need to see some benefit back to them. So I'm more optimistic than I have been. Cynical, but optimistic.
Thank you for that. We have a questioner. Bob.
Thank you, Alice. To my two friends on the stage, I'd like you to, with emphasis added, please share with the audience why Alaskans are a little bit cynical of the administration's view, both the agencies and the White House, on consult and kind of a conversation with Alaskans, the state of Alaska, and the indigenous people of Alaska before Arctic initiatives are presented to Alaska.
You want to go first? Yeah. Go ahead, give it a try.
Okay. Hi, Bob. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be able to sit here with Senator Murkowski and my friend Alice and have the opportunity to answer a few questions. I should qualify before I answer any questions that I'm actually going to speak as an Alaskan. I am not an employee of the federal government. I chair the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which is a separate federal commission which gives advice to the federal government when they choose to listen to it. And I provide advice to Secretary Kerry on Arctic Council-related things, but I am not an employee, and I think it's best for me to qualify that my answers today on this panel will be based on the experiences that I have had in a variety of positions over the years, and as someone who has had the opportunity to be able to reflect over the years on how different the relationships between the federal government and the state government, and for that matter, local governments, have changed over the years. So specifically to answer your question about relationship building, when I was lieutenant governor, there was a very interesting process that doesn't exist anymore that had the lieutenant governor and the Secretary of the Interior representative in Alaska co-chair a federal land managers forum. That forum provided kind of an ongoing opportunity for the state land managers and the federal land managers to have dialogue. That doesn't exist anymore. It has existed in a variety of different formats, but I offer it up as an example of one of the kinds of techniques, let's say, that can be used to really promote the opportunity for the federal land managers and the state land managers. And let's remember, they both manage a lot of land. 365 million acres in the state of Alaska. I can always remember that because there's a million acres for every day of the year. But of those 365 million acres, the state of Alaska has 105 of them. Actually received title to 90, but 105. 105 million acres the state is responsible for. How big is that? The state of California. So the state of Alaska has the state of California to manage for 750,000 people. And the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the federal government, the rest, only 1% private ownership. I say that for those of you who aren't Alaskans to be able to get some sense of this important question that Bob raises about the responsibilities of the land managers. The federal land managers manage federal lands in Alaska on behalf of the United States of America. The state of Alaska manages 105 million acres, the state land grant at statehood, largely for the benefit of Alaskans, although in many instances for a broader audience as well. And of course, the Alaska Native corporations have a responsibility to manage for their shareholders in the best interests of the Alaska Native shareholders. So this is a complex world in Alaska. And we have different interests, different statutory mandates, different constituencies, different goals. And so when you see the kind of tug of war that is happening right now in the media about what is the best way to manage the Outer Continental Shelf, what's the best way to manage NPRA or ANWR, what's the best way for the state of Alaska to manage its lands, there's a lot to talk about. And I only offered up the suggestion of one way that we used to do that, of the Land Managers Forum, to provide kind of an ongoing dialogue that doesn't change either the federal mandates or the state mandates under law, or the obligations of those land managers to their respective constituencies. But it does provide more opportunity for dialogue. And that's one of the things, Bob, that I think might be a good idea. Clearly, given the increased amount of attention being paid to Alaska not just because of climate change, although that's a big one, not just because of global economics, that's a big one, not just because of oil and gas or because of the fact that the media has decided that this is a really interesting place, but that attention has also been with federal agencies moving forward under the National Arctic Strategy, which was adopted in 2013, under the Implementation Plan, adopted in 2014, under the executive order that was just adopted a week ago to basically provide mechanisms to move that National Arctic Strategy forward, it's probably not a big surprise that there's going to be a lot more to talk about. So at the federal state level, I would say we could come up with some mechanisms that would improve the dialogue, not necessarily change anybody's point of view, but that dialogue would be more meaningful. And secondly, from the state and local perspective, I'll say one more thing. You know, Alaska is the only coastal state in the United States that doesn't have a Coastal Management Act. And it has the biggest coastline in the United States. We had one for years and years, and it provided a mechanism for local governments, the state government, and federal agencies to have an ongoing dialogue in the decisions that needed to be made about not just permits, but also land planning in the coastal zone. It gave to the state of Alaska leverage over federal agencies because federal agency permitting process had to be consistent with the Alaska Coastal Management Plan. And similarly, it gave to local governments leverage with state agencies who also ought to be required to listen to local governments, if you ask me as a former mayor. So this is another tool that I might just put on the table, Bob, as an example of something that would improve not just dialogue, but in the case of the coastal management law, federal, state, and local government coordination and actually implementation because of the way the law is written, beyond what we're doing now. And I think it might be more productive for us to focus on ways that we might build out a more effective system than to just spend a lot of time not being happy with decisions that are made by land managers who are acting within the realm of their responsibilities. Sorry for the long answer.
Fran, may I just ask quickly to clarify, just because I'm not aware of this past land management dialogue process, was that convened voluntarily? Was there some executive order at state or federal level to make it happen? Did it require legislation?
Did not require legislation. The Secretary of Interior and the Governor of the state of Alaska agreed in an memorandum of agreement that the state of Alaska and the federal government would undertake this Land Managers Forum, and it existed under the Knowles administration.
Okay, thank you.
I want to just add a couple comments because I appreciate what Fran has outlined in terms of structures and opportunities to move forward positively. We, as Alaskans, and when we were asked to stand, those of you that are from Alaska, we're probably maybe a quarter of the people in the group, maybe a third here. I think as Alaskans, there has been this sense that folks in Washington, D.C. are just kind of walking over us. They're not listening to us. We've got to make sure that consultation is meaningful. I think you used the word cynical again. We do want to make sure that it is meaningful consultation, that it is collaboration, that is real, that we are participants, even if we don't have, quote, that seat at the table as we would like. I think it is important to recognize that there are 40 offices and agencies from across 16 different federal agencies that are participants in this Arctic Policy Group, which is this informal interagency group led by the State Department. When you've got that many agency folks represented, it can get kind of overwhelming, like, well, wait a minute, where are those people that are most affected? Where are they in this conversation? And when you asked that question, I pulled out the copy that I have of the executive order that was released last week. And I have to tell you, when I read it, I did highlight where the order specifically referred to the people. And I don't have very many highlights in this executive order, which as an Alaskan concerns me. And then when I look to the section regarding engagement with the state, Alaska Native tribal governments, as well as other United States stakeholders, I looked at that and I said, good. It's positive that we have direct acknowledgement regarding the state's roles, Alaska Native tribal governments. But it does concern me when they say, it is in the best interest for the nation, for the federal government to maximize transparency and promote collaboration where possible with the state of Alaska, Alaska Native tribal governments, and similar Native Alaska Native organizations. And as an Alaskan, that where possible drives me crazy. It's like, it should be everywhere. So I have suggested to those of you on the commission, you and Senator McGuire, don't be afraid to invite yourself to places where you perhaps aren't invited. Because I do think that it is important that there be a recognition as to the role that Alaska plays and that our Alaska Native peoples play as we talk about these policies. Now, that doesn't make me too very popular with the folks that are trying to orchestrate this at the federal level, but I feel very, very strongly that as Alaskans, we want to make sure that we are not just considered yet another entity that is out there that perhaps has a loud voice.
One other question, or Rachel, are you also waiting to ask a question? Should we give Rachel the floor? Okay.
Okay, well, hopefully this can be quick because you just mentioned the one of the actions coming out of the White House, Lisa. This might be a bit of a controversial question, but in the hopes that you're both in a full disclosure mood, I will ask it anyways. I think that most people in the room have been wondering this throughout the weekend. We all know that in recent weeks, the different announcements and actions coming out of the Obama administration caused the Alaska congressional delegation to hold a press conference, that's the word, declaring the actions to be an assault against Alaska or an attack. And I would like to know what both of you think about that in regards to the U.S. taking the chair of the Arctic Council and how that attack or assault is going to impact the politics as we take the chair.
Well, you ask about the choice of words, and I will stand by it because I have made those words, and I think made them not only very clearly, but perhaps very loudly as an Alaskan, and I think Senator McGuire alluded to this in her comments. There were some promises made to us at statehood. There were conditions, there was a compact that basically said, as Alaskans, you will provide for yourself and your people through accessing the resources of the land. And so when a promise is made and promises aren't kept, as an Alaskan, that I find deeply, deeply troubling. And I think the use of the word assault, which is pretty provocative, I acknowledge that, came about because it was not just an announcement that this administration was going to move towards placing ANWR in wilderness status. It was a recognition that there were 3 actions coming out of the administration in the same week that would limit our opportunities as a state going forward to access our oil and gas resources in the Arctic region by permanently shutting off access to ANWR, by further limiting areas in our offshore, and putting considerations on leasing opportunities within the National Petroleum Reserve, the area that's been designated, go over there, don't touch ANWR, go over here, that would effectively put the brakes on what the operators have been proposing, trying to build out since 1998 when those leases were purchased by Conoco. So as I look to how we as a state are going to take care of our citizens, how we're going to make sure that we have a budget that we can work with, and as has been mentioned, $3.5 billion in the hole this year, with a pipeline that is less than half full. How are we as a state going to prepare ourselves for the needed infrastructure that I think we all must embrace as we see a changing Arctic? Now, I'm not suggesting that the state of Alaska is the one that builds out that deep water port, but our reality is as a state, we've got to make financial commitment as well. And we can talk about revenue sharing and what that will bring. We can talk about private-public partnerships. But at the end of the day, the state is going to be stepping up as well. And if our opportunity to provide for increased production that will bring us increased revenues to our state is limited because of our federal policies, what are we to do? So you asked the question about the comments made in reaction to the administration's announcements and how that may implicate our leadership coming up in just a few short months here. This administration, I think, has made very, very clear that their priorities with assuming the chair of the Arctic Council are a clean and definite, I shouldn't say clean, but a very definite focus on climate and climate change. And I acknowledge that climate change must be one of those issues that we address with other Arctic nations, using this as a forum to do so. But it cannot be our only mission set. It cannot be our only directive coming out of our chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And this is why I feel so strongly that we need to build on what Canada has outlined with a focus on the northern people. Let's not forget about those who live and work and raise their families there and have been doing so for thousands of years. So I'm worried that we have kind of thrown down the marker here with the administration in saying our focus is going to be on climate, and we believe so strongly that we're effectively moving forward with policies that will limit the opportunity for increased revenue production from oil and gas from the north. So I'm worried about it. It's something where, again, going back to Bob's point here about the role of Alaskans, I think we need to be engaged and clearly speaking up on behalf of the indigenous peoples, as well as those of us who have only been there for a few generations, and for the newcomer that will come next week. So I don't need to conclude by saying I think you know how I feel about these actions. We need to continue to work with this administration. But I will also remind everybody that we will continue to be heading up the Arctic Council after this administration is no longer in office. I want to make sure that the priorities that we have advanced while chairman continue in a positive manner beyond the time that we are no longer chairing the council. This can't just be viewed as, well, we've got the gavel for a couple years, but after that, the Arctic is no longer a priority. That can't be the direction. I've gone on too long and taken Fran's time.
You raise a question that has many pieces to it, and I'll try to be clear. You ask whether or not the recent action by the administration with regard to either ANWR or OCS development might have some impact on the way in which the U.S. Arctic Council chairmanship might proceed. I guess there are at least three answers to that. The first answer is not in the international setting, because, I mean, if you think whether Norway goes forward with oil and gas development in the Lofoten Islands or not, doesn't really play out at the Arctic Council table. It's important to Norwegians, but it's not something that is kind of front and center any more than if Greenland decides to lease in a particular area. That's not really in the Arctic Council arena. How it does play out may be very well the relationship between the federal government and the state government, or between the administration and the congressional delegation in terms of the general atmospherics. But in terms of the Arctic Council table, not really, because it's a domestic decision. Which brings me to the second important point that I'd like to make, which I made yesterday, but I'm going to make it again because some of you weren't here. We have to talk about two spheres here, or otherwise we're just in a big Arctic soup. There is the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council over here in this sphere, and the whole Arctic Council functioning process and that international arena. And then there is domestic policy with regard to the Arctic, with regard to Alaska. That domestic policy, as it is articulated in the National Arctic Strategy or in any of the specific decisions that may be made by NOAA or the Coast Guard or EPA or anybody else. And the more we kind of confuse those things, the more difficult it is for us to think clearly about how we proceed. Individuals, as elected officials, as state government people, I just encourage you to think about that. Because under the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, we are playing in an arena where the 8 Arctic nations and the permanent participants and the observing nations and observers focus on 2 important primary objectives, and has since the Arctic Council started in 1996. Protecting the Arctic environment and sustainable development. And all of the work that's done by consensus by the Arctic Council is in that arena. And the U.S. chairmanship agenda includes 3 things that have been part of the Arctic Council for a long time. Yes, climate change, but also Arctic Ocean safety, security, and stewardship, and improving the living conditions of the people of the Arctic. Now, improving the economic and living conditions of the people of the Arctic builds on the Canadian chairmanship. and the stewardship of the Arctic Ocean and the climate change. Those three things are very consistent with what the Arctic Council has focused on for years and will continue to focus on even after the US is no longer chair. Adriana Muir yesterday during her presentation gave a very detailed explanation of the projects that are moving forward under those three tiers. And if you didn't have an opportunity, I would encourage you, first of all, at the back table to pick up this very simple The Arctic Council, a backgrounder, because I know we all assume everybody knows everything, but there's no way we can do that. So pick up this one pager about how the Arctic Council actually works, and then go to the State Department website and see the general layout of these three principal areas. So I think those things, again, in this sphere, are moving forward with a fairly robust engagement with permanent participants, with the state of Alaska. I know Bob and Liesl have consulted with, as have many others, with the State Department about how to give a robust, project-oriented, forward movement for the Arctic Council under those three areas. So the final point that I will make in response to the question, which is basically, how do we move forward as a state when there is this much inconsistency, at least as it appears from, the last week or two, on major management of an oil and gas resource, which is important to both the state and the nation and conceivably the world. And here I will try not to get into too much trouble. But, in a sense, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the ANWR debate, which has been going on for decades, has not really changed all that much, until Congress acts. Really nothing by way of permanent decision, by way of either designating it as wilderness or allowing for oil and gas activity or any other activity. Really, practically speaking, there are fine shadings on whether or not what the president has suggested and what the Secretary of Interior will do will have minor modifications of any kind of management. There'll be debates about that. But basically, it's in Congress's lap to make a permanent long-term decision. And as Lisa knows, over the years, I've tried to broker a deal that actually takes into consideration that within the National Petroleum Reserve, there are some very special areas that have just as much biological value in terms of an ecological value as what's in ANWR. And similarly, there are places in ANWR that perhaps you could arrange and negotiate a limited drill opportunity that would still protect the eastern two-thirds, which is the area that has been identified consistently by scientists as having some of the highest biological value. So, if people actually wanted, as opposed to just being kind of rigid in one camp or the other, there's an old saying that being in the middle is the most dangerous place to be. And this is a great example of one of those. There are rational approaches that one could actually make that would protect key areas, perhaps permanently in a wilderness status, and other areas where you could allow drilling carefully with a lot of restrictions, recognizing the incredible values and vulnerability of this region. But lately in our country, the idea of actually striking compromises has been a tough sell. It's been a really tough sell. And I guess I would just urge people who are thinking perhaps a little rigidly about where we are right now in this debate or this discussion or this disagreement or however you want to put it, to maybe just think a little more openly. Some of the areas that Secretary of Interior has now said will be set aside, like Hannah Shoal and like a bowhead whale migration route along the coast. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because these are areas that are important for subsistence. These are areas that are incredibly important based on every bit of science that has ever been done, and it reflects the values of local people. So some of the things that seem like, gee, maybe it's a dramatic decision, if you take the pieces of it and try to understand why, how, where, and maybe be open to some compromise. I think there's a lot to talk about. I really do.
And with that, I'm afraid we are out of time. I'm going to add my one very short PS, which is I think that there's an element here that may be the elephant in the room when it comes to the things that Alaskans don't say often enough, which is you who are not from Alaska in this audience must come see Alaska to understand any of this in a way you can't by reading about it. And with respect to the cruise companies, I don't mean get on a cruise ship. I mean come see Alaska, go to Barrow, go to Kotzebue, go to Nome, go to Bethel, drive up to the top of the Haul Road, do anything you can to begin to understand this great land and all of its many complexities. Thank you.
Thanks.